NORTHGATE. So glad to be back with you tonight. You're going to have to excuse me. I'm on the downside of about a 3-day head cold. So I'm getting better. Thank you, Jesus. And we were at Foursquare Convention last week, and I think I picked it up in the hotel room or something. It got real cold in there. So anyway, we're just glad to be back. We had a great convention, and a lot of good things happened. You'll be hearing about some of them for sure. But tonight we want to resume our study in the book of Acts. The last time we were together, we did verses 1 through 11 in chapter 23. And so we're going to pick it up at verse 12 of chapter 23 tonight. But just before we do that, I just kind of want to remind you of what has taken place in the beginning of this chapter. The Apostle Paul was before the High Council of Jerusalem. And so they almost began to riot, and there was a fort that was just up above the hill above them. There were steps leading to the fort, and took a couple of times that the soldiers of the fort actually had to come down, rescue Paul, take him to the fort, and so this was one of those times, but. They were trying to say that Paul was teaching bad things about the Jewish religion, their traditions, and that he was speaking against the temple. And so they didn't want to believe that Paul was even a Jew. So anyway, what's happened here? Let me read the last couple of verses. We'll start with verse 10. It says, as the conflict grew more violent, the commander was afraid that they would tear Paul apart. So there were quite a few people that were wanting Paul's head here. And so he ordered his soldiers to go and to rescue him by force and take him back to the fortress. That night, though, so Paul's back in the fortress, that night the Lord appeared to Paul and said, be encouraged, Paul. Just as you have been a witness to me here in Jerusalem, you must preach the good news in Rome as well. And so the Lord has already seen Paul going to Rome. So we need to keep that in mind because that's very, very important. So point number one, there's a plot to kill Paul. A plot to kill Paul. Let's read verses 12 and 13 here. The next morning, a group of Jews got together, and they bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink anything until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 of them in this conspiracy. So there were more than 40 Jews that wanted to actually kill Paul. Now it didn't, Paul made to kill Paul, they made a special promise to themselves that they wouldn't eat or drink anything until they had killed Paul. I mean, they were very sincere in their desire to see Paul dead. They even told the chief priests and the leaders about the promise. They vowed not, as I said, not to eat or drink anything until Paul was killed. Not just dead. I mean, hear the language here. We're not going to wait for Paul to die in prison or somewhere down the road, but we want to kill Paul. They wanted to kill him. So I want you to try to imagine the evil that was in their heart. Okay? In verses 14 and 15, they went to the leading priests and the elders, and they told them, we have bound ourselves with an oath to eat nothing until we have killed Paul. So you and the high council should ask the commander to bring Paul back. Remember, Paul's in the fort. So to ask the commander to bring Paul back to the council again, pretend, hear that word? Pretend that you want to examine this case more fully, and we will kill him on the way. So, it was so hard to kill Paul while he was in the fort. There were well over 450 soldiers at the fort. Those who planned that the Jewish leaders would go to the soldiers and go to the soldiers' fort and persuade them to come back to them. They told him they wanted to discuss the situation with Paul. They wanted to examine him more. But that was just a total lie, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to ambush him on the road back to the temple. They wanted Paul to come out from the protection that he was under at the fort so that they could kill him. I got to tell you, Paul was in great danger here. He really was. And that's basically needless to say. But so Paul was under house arrest there at the fort. He could not leave the fort, but he could have visitors. He could have visitors. So let's go to verses 16 and 17. But Paul's nephew, his sister's son, heard of their plan, and he went to the fortress and he told Paul the plan. Paul called for one of the Roman officers and says, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something important to tell him." Remember, I want you to remember in verse 11, it said that God spoke to Paul that night he was in the fort. He said, just as you have witnessed me here in Jerusalem, you're going to also do it in Rome. Paul always wanted to go to Rome to share the gospel. And so God promised Paul that he would go to Rome. Even when it looked like he was about to die, he had to remember the promise of God. You know, sometimes we get ourselves in situations where things are rough, things are bad, and we're experiencing some sort of difficulty in our life. But then it takes a few moments to remember the promises that God has made us, has made to our families, has made about our children, has made about our ministry. God has made promises to us all the time, and God wants to use us in great ways. And so here it looks like Paul's ready to die. If they could invade that fort, they would, but they were planning to kill him on the roadside. We just need to remind ourselves, if God promises something, it's going to happen. It didn't look like that. It didn't look like that for Paul at this point, but no human can stop God's plan. I want you to hear that tonight. No human can stop the plan of God for your life. We don't know anything here about Paul's sister or even about his nephew, except that the nephew came to see Paul. I don't know if they were Christians or not. We only know that he was young. They estimate him to be about 13 or 14 years old, so he was a teenager. And in verse 17, it tells us that Paul sent for the captain. After he spoke to his nephew, Paul sent for the captain, and he asked the captain to take Paul's nephew to the commander, because he had something to share with the commander. He wanted to tell the commander about the plot to kill Paul. So if they come and ask you, let Paul come back, you know, this is the news that Paul's nephew had. So let's go on here. Let's look at verses 18 and 19. So the officer did, explaining Paul the prisoner called me over and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. The commander took his hand, led him inside, and asked, "What is it you want me to know?" And so the captain did what Paul asked, and the captain realized that this was urgent. And verses 20 and 21, Paul's nephew told him, "Some Jews are going to ask you to bring Paul before the high council tomorrow, pretending that they want to get some more information, but don't do it," the young man said. "Don't do it. There are more than 40 men hiding along the way, ready to ambush him, and they vowed not to eat or drink anything until they have killed him. They are ready now, just waiting for your consent." And so Paul's nephew began to tell the commander about this plot to kill his uncle, and he told them that they were waiting for his decision. The young man also at this time urged the commander, "Don't do this thing that they want you to do. Basically, my uncle's life is on the line. Don't do this thing. Verse 22, we read that the commander, listen, here's verse 22. Don't let anyone know that you told me this, the commander warned the young man. So the commander knew that Paul was a Roman citizen, okay? And so the commander needed to do something really quickly. And that's important. If he was just a Jewish man, a rabbi, or a follower in that way, and he was causing this kind of trouble, or a person of the way, a Christian, but the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen meant a lot. Meant that they could not harm another citizen without a trial or without a reason to even put him on trial. So he told the young man to keep their conversation a secret. Second point. The commander makes arrangements now, verses 23 through 25. Then the commander called two of his officers and ordered, now I want you to get these numbers. He said, get 200 soldiers ready to leave for Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. So and also take 200 spearmen and 70 mounted troops. Provide horses for Paul to ride, and get him safely to Governor Felix, and then he wrote this letter to the governor. So verses 23 through 25, as we just read, the commander ordered 470 soldiers to prepare themselves to take Paul to the governor Felix. He said, go with Paul, protect him. That many soldiers was about half of what they actually had at the fort. So this was a big deal. They took half of their soldiers and escorted Paul, and he escorted Paul with a letter to Felix explaining the situation. Felix was the governor. Now, this commander, he writes this letter, and this is what he says in verse. And this, our third point is the letter to Felix, Felix the governor. Verses 26 through 30. And so here's the letter that he wrote. From Claudius Lysias. So now we finally learn the commander's name. Until now, we didn't even know his name. Lysias. To the Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by some Jews, and they were about to kill him when I arrived with troops. When I learned that he was a Roman citizen, I removed him to safety. Then I took him to their high council to try to learn the basis of their accusations against him. I soon discovered that the charge was something regarding their religious law. Certainly nothing worthy of imprisonment or death. But when I was informed of a plot to kill him, I immediately sent him on to you. I have told his accusers to bring charges before you. So, this letter was delivered to the governor, Governor Felix, and Governor Felix was a very important man. We also learn here that the commander's name, as I said, was Lysias, and that he learned that Paul was a Roman citizen, and that is the whole reason why he went and rescued him. In verse 28, Lysias doesn't even mention the fact that he nearly whipped Paul or beat him to death, nor did he mention that he put him in chains, because if he would have told Felix that, I've already put him in chains, I've already whipped him, he could have been in a lot of trouble because he was a Roman citizen. Lysias wanted to let Felix think that he did everything at this point the exact right way. And so in a sense, the letter was true, but the letter left out a lot of things too. It didn't tell him what he had already done to Paul. In verse 29, it says that Paul had done nothing that was against Roman law, and the Jews were saying that Paul had taught things against the Jewish law and also against the temple. This was not something that Roman rulers even wanted to decide on. I think I've mentioned it before, but the Roman rulers, they sort of, how do I want to say this? they sort of just kind of went along with things. They always tried to keep peace with the Jews and with the leadership of the Jews in the temple. But they didn't really want to get involved in their religious squabbles. They just didn't want to decide on something like this. And also Lysias, the commander, he didn't want to be responsible for Paul's death. So sending Paul to Felix was the right thing to do. And lastly, here, Paul goes to Caesarea. Okay, verses 31 through 35. Let's read that. So that night, as ordered, the soldiers took Paul as far as Antipatris, and they returned to the fortress the next morning, while they mounted troops and took him to Caesarea. When they arrived in Caesarea, they presented Paul and the letter to Governor Felix. He read it, and then he asked Paul what province that he was from. Cilicia, Paul answered. I will hear your case myself when your accusers arrive. The governor said that to him, I'll hear your case when your accusers arrive. Then the governor ordered to keep him in the prison at Herod's headquarters. So the entire journey to Caesarea from where Paul was at in the fort was about 65 miles. And so obviously they allowed Paul to ride a horse along with about 70 others, because Felix, the governor of Judah, was now going to be responsible for Paul and what would happen to Paul. But the commander, Lysias, he needed to explain the situation to Felix, and he did so in this letter. Usually a prisoner had his trial in the province that the crime would have been committed in, if there even was a crime. And in Paul's case, there was no crime. That was why Felix asked Paul, what province are you from? And again, Paul answered, Cilicia. Felix was going to wait for Paul's accusers to arrive. Now, this was going to take, from Jerusalem to Caesarea, this was going to take about 5 days for them to get there. And in the meantime, Paul ordered, Felix ordered Paul to stay in the palace. He was under arrest, but he was to stay in the palace, not a jail. Now, this palace was built by King Herod the Great, and so you can only imagine what type of prison situation this was. He could have visitors; people could come and see him, people that were kind to Paul and that sort of thing. But Paul was still a prisoner, but at least he was safe and he was comfortable. So it looks like Felix was respecting the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen. And so we're going to see next week in chapter 24, Felix is going to hear the case against Paul. The Jews coming from Jerusalem are going to present their case to Felix, and Felix is going to make some observations and some decisions on Paul. We'll get into all that next week, but it's still so good to be back, and glad you're joining with us tonight. This is a great part of the book of Acts, and we see that the early church is having its difficulties and persecutions and this and that, but Paul was just preaching the gospel. Remember, God made Paul a promise. It didn't look like he'd ever see Rome, but God made Paul a promise that he was going to go to Rome to preach the gospel. And so let's leave tonight thinking, even for ourselves, God keeps his promises with me. Amen? Well, God bless you. Have a great night and hope to see you Sunday.